By the fourth night of a storm that would later be called the 9-day whiteout, a family walked out into weather that could kill a person in 20 minutes, feeling their way along a rope strung between two houses because the fire in their own home had already died. They were walking toward the one house in the valley everyone had laughed at 3 months earlier for wasting good straw on something as strange as a wall. Tonight, that house was the only one still warm.
There is a particular kind of warning that every parent eventually gives, in one form or another, to a child who is finally old enough to be trusted with something dangerous. Not too far, not too fast, not too much. It is, on its surface, the simplest advice in the world. The wisdom of the middle path, spoken by someone who has already learned, through long and careful experience, exactly where the edges of disaster lie. And it is a peculiar, aching feature of being alive that this same simple warning, spoken with total love and total clarity, so often fails completely, the very first time it is truly tested. Tonight we are going to follow the story of a father who built his own son a pair of wings, who gave him the one instruction that could have saved his life, and who watched, from the empty air beside him, as his son ignored it. This is not, in the end, a story about foolishness alone. It is a story about the particular helplessness of loving someone whose joy in the one moment that matters most outruns their caution. To understand how a father and a son ever came to be, flying at all, high above the wine-dark sea, we must go back to the beginning of an entire life spent building things no one else could imagine. His name was Daedalus, and long before he ever built a pair of wings, he was already known throughout Greece as the most gifted craftsman and inventor the world had yet produced. He was said to have built the first true statues with open eyes and separated legs, figures that seemed almost to breathe and to walk on their own, so lifelike that the old stories claim they had to be chained down at night to keep them from wandering off the pedestals where he had set them. Travelers came from distant cities simply to stand before his workshop doors, hoping for a glimpse of whatever strange and wonderful device he happened to be building that season. And kings across the Greek world were known to send envoys asking for his services, offering fortunes for even a small commission of his time. He built tools that no one had thought to build before. He solved problems of engineering and design that other men did not even know how to properly describe. He was, in every sense, the old Greeks understood the word, a genius, and it is worth pausing on that word for a moment, because genius in this story will prove to be a gift with a very sharp and very dangerous edge. A mind that can solve any problem placed before it can also, when left unchecked, begin to measure its own worth entirely by comparison to the minds around it. And it is precisely this quiet, corrosive habit of comparison that would soon cost Daedalus the one home he had ever known. For genius of that magnitude does not always sit easily beside other people's talent, and Daedalus, brilliant as he was, harbored a flaw that would eventually cost him everything he had built in Athens. He took on his own young nephew as an apprentice, a boy named Perdix, whose mother had sent him to learn the family craft from her famous brother. And Perdix, it soon became clear, was gifted in his own right, perhaps, in certain small ways, even more naturally gifted than his uncle. Watching the spine of a fish one day, the boy is said to have invented the saw, cutting a row of teeth into a strip of iron in imitation of the fish's bones. He is said to have invented the compass as well, for drawing perfect circles, a tool that would prove useful to craftsmen for the rest of human history. Daedalus watching his own students shadow him in inventiveness while still barely more than a child, felt something ugly take root in his heart. A jealousy so consuming that he could not bear to watch it continue to grow. He told himself, at first, that it was simple pride in a promising student, the natural pleasure any master craftsman feels watching a gifted apprentice flourish. But pride curdles quickly into something else entirely when the student's gift begins to outshine the master's own, and Daedalus, alone in his workshop at night, found himself measuring every one of the boy's small triumphs against his own reputation, and finding, to his own private horror, that the comparison troubled him far more than it should have. One day, on the high walls of the Acropolis in Athens, Daedalus took his nephew up to admire the view, and in a moment of cold, calculated rage that the old stories never once try to soften or excuse, he pushed the boy from the heights. He would later claim, when questioned, that the boy had simply fallen. But the goddess Athena, who watches over cleverness and craft in all its forms, is said to have taken pity on the falling boy in that instant and transformed him into a partridge before he struck the ground, so that Perdix lived on, though never again in human form. A small, low-flying bird that, to this day, old naturalists insisted, never builds its nest in high places and never flies far above the ground, as though some ancient memory of that fall had been written permanently into the instincts of every partridge that has lived since. It is worth sitting with this origin for a long moment, because it changes everything about how we understand what follows. Daedalus, the man who would one day build his own son a pair of wings and warn him, with total sincerity, never to fly too high, was himself the reason a young boy could never trust heights again. The very same craftsman whose grief over a falling son would echo through 3,000 years of retelling had once, in a fit of jealous rage, been the cause of someone else's fall. Whether this connection was placed there by the ancient tellers of the tale deliberately, as a kind of moral architecture beneath the surface of the story, or whether it is simply the way that old myths so often rhyme with themselves across a single life, it gives Daedalus's later grief a shape it would not otherwise have. The man who mourns a son lost to the sky had once caused a similar fall himself and walked away from it. For that crime, the court of the Areopagus in Athens tried Daedalus for murder. And though the details of his sentence vary across the old tellings, the outcome was the same in every version. Daedalus was exiled from his home city, stripped of the reputation he had spent a lifetime building, and forced to seek his fortune far from the only place he had ever called home. He left Athens, the old accounts suggest, without a single farewell to the city that had made him famous, unable to face the neighbors and patrons who had once admired him, and now, quite rightly, could not look at him without seeing a murdered boy turned into a bird. He sailed east, across the sea, to the island kingdom of Crete, where a powerful king named Minos ruled over a court as wealthy and as strange as any in the ancient world. A court that, as it happened, was in desperate need of exactly the kind of genius Daedalus could offer. King Minos's own household carried a secret shame at its center, a monstrous creature called the Minotaur, half man and half bull, born from a curse the gods had placed upon the royal family. This creature could not simply be housed in an ordinary room or an ordinary prison. It needed a structure so vast and so confusing that it could never find its own way out, and so cleverly built that no one who entered it, seeking to hunt or feed the beast, could ever fully map its turns and return safely to the surface. It was exactly the kind of impossible engineering problem that Daedalus, more than any craftsman alive, was suited to solve. He built the great Labyrinth of Knossos, a maze of such staggering, disorienting complexity that even Daedalus himself, the stories say, could barely remember its full design once it was finished. He is said to have worked on its design for years, walking every corridor himself as it rose stone by stone, testing dead ends and doubling passages, layering deception upon deception until even the workmen who had built each individual wall with their own hands could no longer find their way from one end of the structure to the other without a guide. King Minos rewarded him handsomely for the work, and for a time Daedalus found in Crete something like the standing and comfort he had lost in Athens. A new home, a Cretan woman he took as a companion, and eventually a son, Icarus, born and raised within sight of the very maze his father had built. And the Minotaur was sealed within it, fed, in the years that followed, on a grim tribute of youths and maidens sent from conquered Athens. It was this same labyrinth and this same tribute that would one day bring the young hero Theseus to Crete, determined to enter the maze and slay the monster at its heart. And it was Daedalus, in a small but fatal act of quiet rebellion against his own royal patron, who made that victory possible. When the Cretan princess Ariadne came to him in secret, desperate to help the foreign hero she had fallen in love with, it was Daedalus who suggested the simple, elegant solution that would undo his own greatest work. A single thread, unspooled behind Theseus as he entered the maze, so that he could always find his way back out again by simply following it home. It was a solution so basic, so far, beneath the genius of the labyrinth's own design, that it is almost an act of contempt for his own creation, as though some part of Daedalus, forced for years to build ever more elaborate walls to contain a monster he had never wanted to imprison in the first place, was quietly pleased to see a single length of string undo the whole cruel machine. When King Minos discovered what Daedalus had done, that his own architect had handed the solution to his labyrinth to the very man who had come to kill his monstrous stepson and steal away his daughter, his fury was absolute. Daedalus, along with his young son Icarus, was seized and imprisoned, and in the cruelest and most fitting irony the old stories could devise, the two of them were locked away inside the very labyrinth Daedalus himself had built, the one structure in the entire world designed so perfectly that even its own architect could not easily find his way back out of it. It is worth pausing here on the particular cruelty of this punishment. Minos did not simply execute the man who had betrayed him. He trapped him inside a monument to his own genius, transformed suddenly from a masterpiece into a prison, so that every wall Daedalus had ever designed to confound others now confounded him and his own son instead. Guards brought them meager food and little else, and Daedalus, pacing the same corridors he had once walked as their proud architect, is said to have spent long, sleepless nights running his hands along walls he himself had built, searching for some flaw in his own design that might offer even the smallest hope of escape, and finding, again and again, only the same perfect, maddening genius he had once been so proud of. Some of the old tellings place their prison not within the maze itself, but in a high tower overlooking the sea, watched day and night by guards loyal to Minos. But even in this version, the essential cruelty remains unchanged. The king who had once prized Daedalus above every other craftsman in his court now trusted him with nothing at all, and would sooner see his genius wasted behind locked doors than risk it slipping free to serve anyone else again. But a mind capable of building the labyrinth in the first place was never going to accept its walls as truly final. Daedalus understood, better than any man alive, that King Minos controlled every road on the island of Crete and every ship that might carry them away by sea. Minos's fleets patrolled the waters constantly, watching for exactly this kind of escape. There was no path out of Crete along the earth or across the water that Minos did not already command. And so Daedalus, sitting in his confinement and turning the problem over in that same restless, brilliant mind that had built the maze around him, arrived at a solution so audacious that no prisoner before him had ever attempted it. If the king ruled the land and the king ruled the sea, then Daedalus and his son would simply have to leave by neither. They would go by air, a domain that belonged to no king at all. He set about gathering feathers, wherever they could be found within the confines of their confinement. Melted feathers from birds that nested near the labyrinth's high walls, gathered patiently and in secret over what must have been many long days, young Icarus himself helping in whatever quiet way a boy his age could manage, chasing stray feathers across the courtyard whenever a gust of wind threatened to carry them out of reach, laughing, the old tellings suggest, without yet understanding the full gravity of what his father was building, or what it would one day cost him. He arranged them carefully by size, the smallest near the tips and the largest toward the base, binding the shorter feathers together with linen thread and the longer ones with wax softened by the warmth of his own hands, testing each pair of feathers against the light to check the strength of their construction, discarding any that felt too brittle or too thin until, slowly, painstakingly, two great wings began to take shape beneath his careful fingers, curved gently like the wings of a real bird, each one large enough to carry the weight of a grown man through the open air. He built a second, smaller pair for Icarus, sized to a boy who had, by every account, grown up mostly within the shadow of his father's genius, watching him solve problems no other man could touch, and never once imagining that he himself might one day be asked to fly. When the wings were finally finished, Daedalus fitted them to his son's shoulders with his own hands, adjusting the straps, testing the give and pull of each feather, the way any father might fuss over a child before sending them into danger for the very first time. And it was here, in this quiet moment before their escape, that Daedalus gave his son the single instruction on which the entire rest of this story would turn. He knelt so that his eyes were level with his son's, the old tellings say, and made the boy repeat the instruction back to him twice before he would allow either of them to leap from the wall. "Fly the middle course," he told him. "Do not fly too low, or the spray and damp of the sea will weigh down the feathers and drag you under the waves. And do not fly too high, or the heat of the sun will soften the wax that holds these feathers together, and they will come away from your shoulders, and you will fall. Stay close to me. Follow exactly where I lead. The path between the sea and the sun, and nowhere else, is the only path that will carry you home alive." He is said to have embraced his son once, tightly, before they climbed to the high point from which they would launch themselves into the open air. A father's last ordinary embrace, offered without either of them, yet knowing it would be the final one they would ever share. It is worth lingering on the shape of that instruction, a moment longer than the old tellings usually allow, because it is not merely practical advice about the physics of wax and feathers. Every father who has ever handed a child the keys to something dangerous has spoken some version of this same sentence, in his own words, out of his own hard-earned understanding of exactly where the world tends to break people who move too carelessly through it. It is, in its structure, one of the oldest and most enduring pieces of wisdom the Greeks ever articulated, the golden mean, the idea that virtue and safety alike are so often found not at either extreme, but in the disciplined, unglamorous middle path between excess and deficiency. Too low was death by drowning. Too high was death by fire. Only the narrow, unremarkable band of ordinary caution in between offered any hope of survival at all. Daedalus was not merely teaching his son how to fly. He was handing him, in a single sentence, the whole of his own hard-won understanding of how a life ought to be lived, and asking him, for the very first time, to carry that wisdom entirely on his own, with no hand to steady him once they left the ground. They leapt from the walls of Crete together, father and son, and for a time everything unfolded exactly as Daedalus had planned. The two of them rose steadily into the morning air, wings beating in a slow and careful rhythm, farmers and fishermen far below pausing at their work to stare upward in astonishment at what must have looked, from the ground, like two great birds, or perhaps two gods descending briefly into the world of men. The old poets tell us that a shepherd leaning on his crook, and a plowman resting at his furrow, and a fisherman casting his line, all looked up together at the same passing shadow, and each of them, not knowing what to make of the sight, decided privately that they had witnessed a miracle rather than two escaped prisoners fleeing for their lives. Daedalus led the way, calling back instructions, watching his son's flight with the constant, anxious vigilance of a parent teaching a child to swim in water just slightly too deep for comfort, adjusting his own course again and again to keep Icarus close, to keep him low enough, careful enough, safe enough. But flight, for a boy who had spent his whole life confined to ordinary ground, was not simply a means of escape. It was an intoxication unlike anything he had ever felt before. The old poets describe it almost as a kind of drunkenness, the wind rushing past him, the impossible freedom of an entire sky, opening in every direction at once, the sheer unbelievable joy of a human body doing something no human body had ever been permitted to do. And slowly, without any single dramatic decision to disobey, Icarus began to climb. Not out of defiance, exactly, and not out of any real understanding that he was breaking his father's rule. He climbed the way a child climbs when joy simply outpaces caution, one small triumphant beat of his wings at a time, chasing the pure exhilaration of altitude, of speed, of a freedom that felt, in that singular moment, absolutely limitless. Daedalus, glancing back and finding his son's silhouette smaller and higher against the sky than it should have been, called out in warning. His voice carried away uselessly on the same wind that was lifting his son ever further from him. But Icarus, lost entirely in the golden joy of that first and only flight of his life, was already too far above him to hear, or perhaps too intoxicated by the feeling of it, to fully register the warning, even if some part of it did reach him. He climbed higher still, closer to that vast and brilliant sun, and for a few final glorious moments he must have felt utterly invincible. A boy who had done what no mortal before him had ever managed, soaring free above the whole wine-dark sea, farther from the earth than any human being had ever willingly gone. Below him, his father's voice had already grown faint and distant. One more sound lost among the wind and the beating of his own borrowed wings, and for those few final, glorious moments, nothing in the whole wide sky felt capable of touching him. And then the wax, exactly as his father had warned him it would, began to soften in the growing heat. The feathers along the edges of his wings coming loose, one by one, at first so gradually he may not have even noticed, and then all at once, until there was simply no wing left beneath him at all to hold him in the sky. He fell. The old stories tell it with a stark and terrible simplicity that later poets, in their own retellings, could never quite bring themselves to soften. A boy suddenly tumbling from the height of the clouds, arms and legs still beating uselessly at empty air out of pure instinct, calling for the father who could see him falling and was utterly, completely powerless to close the distance between them in time. Daedalus is said to have folded his own wings and dived after him. Some tellings insist, in a desperate and hopeless attempt to somehow catch what could not be caught, closing perhaps half the distance between them before the sea took his son beneath its surface, leaving Daedalus alone in the empty air above a stretch of water that had, in the space of a single breath, swallowed the only thing in the world he could not bear to lose. He struck the water far below and was gone, swallowed by a sea that has carried his name ever since. The Icarian Sea, a stretch of water near a small island that would likewise come to be called Icaria, so that the whole region of ocean where he died became, permanently, a kind of monument to the one moment his joy outran his father's warning. Daedalus circled back, frantic, calling his son's name across an empty stretch of water that offered no answer at all. He found, in the end, only a scattering of loose feathers floating on the surface of the waves, drifting apart from one another exactly as the careful, painstaking construction his own hands had built now came completely undone in the water, the same way it had already come undone in the sky. There was no body waiting to be recovered easily, not at first, only feathers and wax and the terrible silence of a father who had solved every engineering problem placed in front of him across an entire lifetime, and who had built, with his own hands, the very wings that killed his only child. Every skill that had ever made him the most celebrated craftsman in Greece now felt, in that single unbearable moment, like the cruelest kind of mockery, a genius so complete it could build an escape from the most powerful king in the world, and yet entirely unable to build anything that could hold his own son safely in the sky for a single hour longer than it did. The other fishermen who had watched two great winged shapes cross the morning sky are said to have found the scattered feathers, days later, carried gently to shore by the same tide that had taken the boy, and it was from their account, passed from mouth to mouth along the coast, that the story of the fall first began to spread beyond the small stretch of water where it happened, until it reached every corner of the Greek world, and never once let go of the imagination that received it. It is difficult to imagine a grief more particular or more cruel than the one Daedalus carried in that moment. This was not a father who had failed to protect his son through ignorance, or through absence, or through any lack of skill. He had understood the danger perfectly. He had built the solution himself with obsessive and loving care. He had given the correct warning at the correct moment with total clarity. And it had not been enough, because the danger his genius could not design its way around was never the wax, or the wind, or the height of the sun. It was simply the nature of joy itself, in a young heart-tasting freedom for the very first time, a force that no engineering, however brilliant, could ever fully account for or contain. The old stories tell us that Daedalus eventually recovered his son's body, carried gently to the shore of the nearby island, and buried him there himself, in the land that would carry Icarus's name forward for all the centuries that followed. It is said that a partridge, the same bird, his own murdered nephew Perdix, had once been transformed into, watched the burial from a nearby tree, and did not sing, as though even that small, low-flying bird understood something of the terrible symmetry unfolding below it. A man who had once caused a boy to fall from a great height, now burying a boy who had fallen from one himself, the echo of his oldest crime arriving, finally, at his own front door in the cruelest possible form. Whether Daedalus himself ever recognized that symmetry, standing over his son's grave, with a small brown bird, watching silently from the branches above him, the old stories do not say. But it is difficult, hearing both halves of his story together, not to feel the shape of some old and patient justice finally closing a circle that had been left open for decades. Daedalus lived on for many years. After this, the old stories tell us, though something in him never fully recovered from that single morning over the Icarian Sea, he continued to Sicily, where he was welcomed by a king who valued his genius as much as Minos once had, and he continued, in the years that followed, to build and to invent temples and fortifications and clever mechanical marvels that delighted the courts that sheltered him. But he never flew again, and he never spoke, by any surviving account, of building wings for anyone else. Some tellings even suggest he dedicated his own set of wings to a god's temple upon reaching safety, as though he could not bear to keep in his own possession the very thing that had carried his son to his death. He is remembered in the histories of that later kingdom less as the man who once built the great Labyrinth of Crete, and more simply as the quiet foreign craftsman who never spoke of his own son and who flinched. Visitors noted whenever a gull or a heron passed too close overhead. His genius, which had once seemed capable of solving any problem the world could set before it, had met in the end exactly one problem it could never solve: the problem of a heart too joyful for one perfect and irrecoverable morning to remember its father's voice. That temple offering was, in its own quiet way, a craftsman's admission that some feats were never meant to be repeated, and some griefs were never meant to be built around a second time. And so we return, at the very end, to the question this whole story was built to ask. Why does joy so often refuse the warnings that are meant to protect it? It is tempting to tell this story simply as a lesson about obedience, a stern reminder that children ought to listen more carefully to their parents. But that reading, I think, misses the deeper and more aching truth the Greeks were reaching for. Icarus was not simply careless, or foolish, or disobedient in any ordinary sense. He was, for the first and only time in his short life, entirely and gloriously free, doing something no human being had ever been permitted to do before him. And the very joy of that freedom was precisely what made his father's careful warning so difficult to hold on to in the moment it mattered most. This is not a story that blames the boy for feeling too much joy. It is a story that simply, quietly, insists that joy and caution are two different forces in the human heart, and that no amount of love and no amount of careful preparation can fully guarantee that the second will always be strong enough to restrain the first. The Roman poets who inherited this story from the Greeks centuries later could not resist adding their own quiet observation to it, that Icarus, in the instant before he fell, had at least known something no cautious, earthbound person would ever know: the taste of a freedom so complete that it was worth, however briefly, forgetting every warning ever given. It is a generous reading, and perhaps a slightly dangerous one, and the old storytellers seem to have wanted us to hold both truths at once. The boy's death was a tragedy his father would carry for the rest of his life. And the boy's flight, for as long as it lasted, was also the single most extraordinary thing any mortal had done. Perhaps that is the real and lasting reason this particular myth has never once loosened its hold on us across 3,000 years of retelling. Every parent who has ever handed a child something dangerous and beautiful, a set of car keys, a first taste of real independence, a doorway into any freedom the child has never been trusted with before, has felt some small echo of exactly what Daedalus felt on that morning over the sea. This is, perhaps, the quiet and universal ache hiding at the center of this 3,000-year-old story. Not that a boy disobeyed his father, but that love itself, however careful, however complete, has a hard limit built into its very nature. You can build the wings with your own hands. You can test every feather, tighten every strap, and speak the warning as clearly and as lovingly as any warning has ever been spoken. And still, in the end, you must let them fly the course themselves, and trust that the golden mean between too low and too high will hold, knowing all the while that it does not always hold, and that some of what you love most in this world will always be, in the final accounting, beyond the reach of your own careful hands. Rest now. Let the wide sky settle quietly overhead, the way it settles over every stretch of sea that has ever carried a name too heavy for it to carry lightly. Some flights end safely, some do not. And the only wisdom any of us are ever truly given is the golden, narrow, imperfect path between the water and the sun, a path we can only ever describe to those we love. Never walk for them, and never fully guarantee they will find their own way safely along.
That's the story of Ellen's hidden hearth, a wall nobody understood until the cold made its case for her. If you want more real winter survival engineering like this every week, subscribe to The Hidden Hearth and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.